President Joe Biden told America that he saved the economy from the brink.
My inherited economy is on the brink. Now our economy is literally the envy of the world. 15 million new jobs in just 3 years, a record, a record. Unemployment at 50-year lows. A record 16 million Americans are starting small businesses, and each one is a literal act of hope.
Still, polls show many Americans are quite dissatisfied with the economy, despite low unemployment numbers and a booming stock market. The economy added 275,000 jobs last month, stronger than expected, but the unemployment rate did creep up to 3.9%.
There appears to be a fundamental rift between Americans' pocketbooks and economists' outlook. While the president and his team say they saved the economy from a full-blown recession, rapid inflation and price hikes on everyday products like food and gas. Did you hear anything, Amber, last night in that speech that would assuage those trying to make ends meet in America?
I really didn't. You know, it seemed like he was really focused on these sort of small, short-term measures like addressing shrinkflation and addressing junk fees. He's been really big on the junk fee thing in regards to credit card late fees or bag fees when you go to the airport, things like that. And surely, like, saving $20 here and there matters to an everyday American. It's not nothing. I don't want to sound like Nancy Pelosi when she said that the tax cuts were crumbs or whatever it was that she said during the Trump administration. But the reality is that food prices are still 25% higher than they were in 2019. Energy prices are up. Everyday goods that Americans really rely on to get through their life are drastically more expensive than they were when Biden took office. And those are the things that really matter when you're determining whether or not an economy is working for you. Americans are still facing incredibly high interest rates. There's a housing shortage right now. Rapid inflation means that every part of their life has gotten more expensive and their wages haven't kept up with it. And so it just doesn't seem like the Biden administration is really taking their concerns seriously. He recently actually gave a message to the American people in talking about ice cream in regards to grocery prices, where he said, "As an ice cream lover, what makes me the most angry is that ice cream cartons have shrunk in size, but not in price. It's a ripoff." And I guess they were trying to do the cutesy thing where Joe Biden is always eating chocolate chip when he decides to give serious answers to major policy questions, like when he decided to talk about immigration and a ceasefire in Gaza while eating an ice cream cone recently. But it just comes across as incredibly tone deaf, and like they really just don't seem to care or understand the real squeeze that American consumers are facing right now.
Right. To say he inherited like an economy that was on the brink of recession, true. Like it was a COVID pandemic. There were a lot of problems with supply chains that caused inflation, thanks to the pandemic mostly and the disruptions related to the pandemic. But what we saw in terms of price increases were not oftentimes the result of those supply chain disruptions. There was a huge problem with price gouging we saw during the beginning of President Joe Biden's term, and he didn't do much to directly address that price gouging. When you're in a time where, you know, people are struggling to keep their jobs, when we're seeing an increase in unemployment, to have prices go up, it's really bad for most American families because that means they're being squeezed at both ends. With wages, you know, trending stagnant since the 70s, adjusted for inflation. So wages are not being increased at the same proportion that prices are. That means people's quality of life, who are everyday working people in the United States, is going down. That's really what needs to be addressed. Yes, he did avoid a full-blown recession. We could have seen a full-blown recession if we didn't have the level of investment and stimulus in the economy. Trump partook in some of that stimulus, some of the packages and policies to address, the recession we could have gone into, and that's great. But when we measure the success of the economy based off of GDP and job growth, it doesn't really say much for how the everyday person is doing. To understand that, we need to look at wages and prices, because they work for a wage and they use those dollars that they get from their wages in their paychecks to purchase groceries, to afford housing. And people are really struggling. And so a lot of the metrics we're using to determine whether or not the economy is doing well or not are not very good. We had 334,000 people added to the pool of unemployed Americans. We have 5.7 million people who want a job who cannot find one. That's a huge problem. To intentionally keep people unemployed has been the explicit goal of Trump and Biden, with the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell. So to boast about adding jobs to the economy, when you have a guy running the central bank, essentially, who wants to do the opposite, wants to have more people unemployed because they believe the labor market's too strong and workers are being paid too much, which is just not true. You can't really be like, hey, things are going well, record unemployment, because your guy's explicit goal is to do the opposite.
I feel the same way about people using the stock market as a measuring tool. It's really only useful in terms of perhaps a future outlook of the economy, but when you're trying to determine the health of someone in that snapshot, it's not a very useful measure. It's not something that, if you're a working or middle class American, is really anything that affects your day-to-day life. Most of those people don't have a ton of money invested in the stock market. So it's not, unless you're about to retire, I guess, not really something that you're super tapped into. You pointed out the price gouging, and I remembered of this time early on in the Biden presidency when he was sort of going to war with the oil companies over claims that they had basically inflated gas prices beyond what they needed to in order to keep pace with inflation and keep their profit margins intact. But at the same time that he did that, he also decided to get rid of a lot of the federal leases, or pause the federal leases for drilling in the United States. And so while he's complaining about the gas prices and the energy prices for American consumers, he's also creating conditions that make it basically impossible for these companies to have any long-term vision for their ability to operate in the United States. And so it really helped create this massive hike in energy prices beyond really what was necessary, because these companies do, of course, look at the stock market and look at the future conditions and policy changes that might happen to determine whether or not they should really invest in creating supply for the American consumer. I also saw there was this Washington Post article that just came out this week that talked about the fact that a lot of utility companies now are really concerned about their ability to supply power to Americans. It says amid explosive demand, America is running out of power. The electric grid in particular is really on the brink of not being able to supply Americans' demands. And so Biden has to be really careful about how he's going to pursue what he calls his clean or green energy agenda, because if you're going to try to make energy prices cheaper, more affordable for Americans, right now that is dependent on reliable, cheap, and abundant energy, which is decidedly the opposite of things like wind and solar and electric, which are not super abundant in the U.S. right now and are not reliable or cheap.
Yeah, it's been the case since 1979 to 2019, so till just before the pandemic. If you look at the data, the money earned by America's biggest companies and corporations off of price increases was due to increasing input costs that are non-labor input costs and unit labor costs. So that money was going to wages, it was going to the salaries of the people working at the companies. 61% of price increases was money that was going to the people producing the product or service with their own two hands, who are workers. But since the COVID pandemic, since the beginning of 2020, what we've seen actually is that only 7.9% of the money made off of price increases was going to labor, was going to wages and salaries of workers at these companies. And actually 53.9% was corporate profit. So if people were, suffering because of the high energy prices at the corporate level, and CEOs are like, oh, we have all of these, additional costs because energy is so expensive, we would see that showing up in the cost analysis. This is by the Economic Policy Institute. We would see that showing up in non-labor input costs, and it's not. They're really just raising prices because they can to get more money, to accumulate more capital. Right now, we have the wealthiest 10% of America owning 93% of stock. And so that's way too much power for corporations to have. If you really want to do something about the economy, you've got to address that corporate power to set things right. And so because Biden hasn't done that, I just really can't say that he did a great job in providing this stimulus. Yes, he avoided a recession, but we really needed a president to avoid a recession, but also get the economy to be in a place where it's one where if you work hard 40 hours a week, you're doing well. You can afford your most basic necessities and maybe also even ice cream.
Yeah, I'd also like to see us go back to a society where you can have one breadwinner in a family and not have to have two working parents just to be able to subsist and send your kids to a good school and have a good standard of living. It's what Senator Elizabeth Warren once called the two-income trap. So a lot of issues facing our economy. I don't think Biden did a very good job of addressing those in last night's State of the Union. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Rising after this.